Welcome to For the New Christian Intellectual. This is our episode for March 2020, and we have brought on Shireen Joanna. She's going to share with us about her experiences in her intellectual development, including some of her main influences in Christianity and in philosophy, as well as what she has observed over the last 23 years living in the United States. She immigrated here from India, and she has a different perspective on Christianity and on leftism and on a lot of these topics. So, Shireen, I should tell people a little bit about who you are. You're a mother and a wife, and you live in Northern Virginia, and you are a writer. You've worked in writing contracts, background in journalism as well, and very passionate about ideas. So share with us just a little bit about yourself and what helped us to connect.
Sure. Hi, Cody. My name is Shireen Joanna, and so I'll start with how I connected with you and Jacob. A couple years ago, I think, or maybe further back, I was looking for any Facebook group or anything out there on social media that made a connection between Ayn Rand's philosophy and Christianity, and I found absolutely none. And even if I had found one, I wanted to make sure that they were rational and actually not trying to force a connection between the two. And then I stumbled onto For the New Christian Intellectual. I basically connected with Cody, you, and with you, Jacob. And to say I was amazed would be an understatement. I was very touched and extremely happy, and that's how we connected. And since then I've followed along and found the group to be exactly what's needed, I would say, in today's culture. And with that, I'll explain where I even got to the point of analyzing and being concerned about today's culture, right? So I did grow up in India, as you mentioned, Cody. I come from a Christian family. And so I was raised in a sort of Western subculture, stumbled onto Ayn Rand's fiction when I was 12, and I immediately took to it for various reasons outside of the scope of this discussion. But all of those reasons turned out to be good because I began developing an individual philosophical consciousness, if you will, from the age of 12 all the way through the age of 21. And through everything else that happened in my life during those years, this was the only foundation and rock that I stood on. Unfortunately, I had not met the Lord Jesus at that point, and I had not had a born-again experience at that point. So Ayn Rand was my religion and everything, right? I then moved to the United States when I was 21, and I've lived here since the year 1997. And during the course of time, I had a born-again experience 9 years ago, and the Bible became my only standard of living after I met the risen Lord Jesus. Now, traditionally, one would say I should have thrown Ayn Rand out the back door or whatever and started becoming a Bible-thumping, soul-saving Christian. I'm not making fun of that, but all I'm saying is, without the foundation of reason, I don't think anyone has a right to go out and try to save anyone else's soul without having a rational foundation for one's own Christianity. And that's where I started spending a lot of time in prayer and reading the Bible and seeking the Lord. And it dawned on me through many years of independent, I guess, thinking, it dawned on me that Rand and the Bible have given me the right lens of reality by which to observe the damage being caused in our culture by the left.
When you have read Rand, she's pointed out collectivism. She's pointed out the political implications of that, but also the idea of collectivism, what it does to a person's heart. Can you share with us how those concepts, you've actually been seeing them in the culture today, and tie that in to your understanding of the teaching of Jesus?
Okay, that's a great question, Cody, and I'll try to do justice to it by keeping myself on track. I want to start by saying, as a writer, I want to say I notice language a lot. And, the the evolution of language in a culture and society especially over a period of, let's say, 10 or 20 years, the evolution of language is very telling um, and reflective of corruption and loss of intellectual integrity in a society. But it's so subtle that I don't think most people notice it. One of the ways in which it saddens me to see sort of a downward spiral, and I'm not saying the old days were the good days, but I do see that there's a downward spiral beginning with the language being used uh, in society as a whole, in corporate jargon, if you will, government contracting, public schools, and now it's seeped into our churches as well. It is all of it has become more explicitly the language of evasion. And there are many, many examples beginning with, moving from the active voice and strong verbs to the passive voice, long, complex sentences designed to like obfuscate rather than reveal clear points, and also the language of we. And if you really look at language, Cody and Jacob, we has come to replace I. I'm. This may seem silly, but as a writer, I just noticed we has come to replace I in the narrative and the shared language of societies, and that I've seen that replacement, the rate of that replacement, as it were, accelerating over the past 10 years, much more so than before, right? Um, and then we have keeping in pace with the language of newscasts and, everything the media throws out, that's constantly in a 24/7, 365 cycle, getting into the minds of your ordinary uh, person on the ground, right? They seem to be beginning to reflect the evasion and the almost the fear of saying I in language itself, literally in language, right? Which then reflects almost a fear of taking pride in individual um, achievements, right from children going to school, taking pride in profit if you start a business, tripping all over themselves to claim that they're not making a profit, even when they are honestly making a profit. And then the worst offenders in terms of language would be these government contractors who, again, bend over backwards to prove to the public, and that's another word that is very popular now. Nobody knows who the public is. It's so vague, but as long as you claim that you're doing something for the public, you've automatically made yourself acceptable with society, right? And so, on one hand, I've noticed the downward spiral of language, and on the other hand, side by side with that is the the evasion gets worse and worse from children, individual adults, and corporate bodies, businesses, and now it's seeped into the church. So think of this dystopian society where everybody is really scared to say I, and this is not science fiction or anything. There's a lot of we, and then when you begin a sentence with we, you go on to say how we are helping the public, or people are trying to take out the profit, honest profits they make, and spinning that into claims that they are all very guilty for making a profit and they're only making money to help the public in some way. Now, what does all of this do to a person's character, right? If it just stops at language, that would be okay, but language is the first indication of corruption that seeps into a person's character. Children from elementary school onwards uh, are absorbing these things like a sponge, growing up right now, I guess, and right from not taking responsibility for getting an F instead of an A in public school, all the way up to feeling entitled to anything and everything from society, but at the same time claiming to be a kind, altruistic person. And altruism, by the way, is another word that they throw out because otherwise you won't get brownie points for making a profit if you don't claim that your profit is going to turn around and serve altruistic needs, right? So with all of this going on, what I see is actually very sad. It's actually very sad. And if this continues for the next 50 years, I'm actually very, very concerned. And this is coming from someone who was just an at-home mom and a writer and didn't even think about all these things even 5 or 6 years ago. So it's sort of taken me by surprise, and now I'm sitting up and beginning to pay attention.
I'm glad that when you're talking there, you mentioned the refusal or inability to take responsibility for getting a bad grade. I think that was a really important example to include in the mix, because I think one of the major psychological or motivating factors that enables this mindset, this sort of collectivistic we mindset in a lot of people, is the fear of individual responsibility, the fear of taking responsibility for one's own actions, for one's own beliefs, and for one's own life. And it's a lot easier to shift that responsibility out, so to speak, to the rest of society or to some group that you happen to be a part of, and to say, we did this. And that way you're sort of hedging your bets. You know, if it's true that you don't get to take all the credit because you're saying we instead of I. So if there's a success, you miss out on getting all of the credit because you're we instead of I now, but you're also hedging your bets because if there's a failure, then it's we, not I. And so it's sort of this sort of like a psychological hedge against failure, which says that people believe that failure is inevitable. And that's another psychological issue that might be driving a lot of this. And when you think about it that way, and you think about these being mechanisms that are used to justify those sorts of mindsets, like the mindset that expects failure, the mindset that shirks off personal responsibility, these are cultural trends that are very, very unhealthy for individuals and for society. I mean, all you have to do is take those two things, the expectation for failure and the shirking off of individual responsibility, and project those two things out a couple decades, and it's not a very pretty picture.
I completely agree with you, Jacob. And I'm glad you mentioned that it starts from a young age, because if you take those two things, what I'm noticing is those very same things that you mentioned multiplied by X number of individuals in a county, in a state, and in a nation, in a country, right? That's when you have collectivism, right? What I'm saying is, what I see as a simple mom and a writer on the ground today, what I see with my 4 kids and their friends, it's not in a vacuum. It has a connection with the work that people like you and Cody are doing to push that wall back, or as it were, to hold that avalanche of collectivism, because these are the individuals who, when all put together, the sum of these individuals are going to go forward into the next 50 years, and it all rolls up and it all has an impact. There is no, it's a myth that daily life on the ground, individual clarity or lack thereof, honesty or lack thereof, all these things happening in individual private lives of children, adults, and families and churches. It's a myth that it doesn't have anything to do with philosophy, or it doesn't have anything to do with politics, or it doesn't have anything to do with, because I've heard my own peers and friends tell me that, oh, why do you really care about all this? It has nothing to do with us. So we are neutral, we are fine. We just switch off the news, or it has nothing to do with us. Or in churches, we go and worship on Sundays, but when you go back home and what the pastor says, however much he or she, I guess, evades, it has nothing to do with us. I used to think that way, that it has nothing to do with me, but I don't any longer, because it has everything to do, with me, and all of this rolls up to the collectivism that we will be seeing in the future if we don't really at least push back now, right? And Jacob, one of the things you mentioned was this individual responsibility. You might know that in public schools, they're not supposed to give a grade of F these days, even if the child failed to study for the exam. Um, and at the end of the year, they have to move everybody to the next grade. So the other day, my daughter, my third child, she's 14, um, and we were talking about grades, and she just said, oh, it doesn't matter because they're not going to fail me anyway. I'll move to the next grade because they're not supposed to fail me. So I will say, my children are lovely children, but I don't even have to go outside of my 4 kids to see how this interplay of the downward spiral in society is affecting each of my children in different ways, because there's an interplay between the personality of the individual child and their interaction and absorbing of things around them. So while child 1 might react differently, child 3 might be different, but I'm able to observe there is a small range within my own family, and and then my kids' friends, I observe that, and then in my company, I have other examples as well.
You mentioned that a lot of people think that these things are irrelevant, and you're pointing out one of the major relevancies for your children, just as one example. And I think the thing that people are failing to realize is that human beings are intellectual beings. We are spiritual, intellectual, and physical beings, and we can't live range of the moment, so to speak. We can't live day to day as though there's no planning and no future. We have to think long range. That's what we were designed to do. We have to think in principle. We have to act in principle. We have to plan. When you are implicitly taught ideas like it doesn't matter what you do, the result's going to be the same, that stunts your ability to think in a healthy way long term. It teaches your child, for instance, to think, okay, this is the way reality is, or at least this is the way society is, that my actions have no bearing on my long-term success or failure, that there's absolutely nothing I can do that's worth doing. And so there's no point to working hard to try to get an A, and there's no point to studying, because it's all going to be the same in the end anyways, is the signal that society is sending to them. And that's devastating psychologically, because if you apply that consistently across the rest of their life, sure, school grades, those aren't that big of a deal. You can kind of make a practical argument that, well, you won't get into good school, or you may not get a good job, you don't have good grades, whatever. But if you apply that same principle, because humans have to think in principle, to other areas of life, and you think about that child acting on that consistently, they would not live a good life. They would not live a holy life.
I completely agree.
They would be sinning and making a shipwreck of their life in many, many ways.
I totally agree with you. I totally do. And to take that further, let's say that child grows up and applies for a job, right? Here's the second example, the continuity of the corruption being caused by the left's narrative, right? Or any narrative that is not aligned with rational living. The child applies for the job, and let's say the child is my own daughter and she's brown skinned. She doesn't get the job, right? Instead of going back home and assessing her own performance at the interview and improving her skills, brushing up on and her technical skills and things like that, and preparing better for the next interview, that child, who's now an adult, is in every danger of telling herself that she didn't get the job because her skin was brown. So you see how the corruption is furthered and furthered until, I'm sorry to say that a person who takes this to the limit, sometimes it becomes too late to change. And an extreme example would be, let's say they end up on government support, or they end up making a total failure of their life, right? Now we've created a person who is envious, bitter, covetous, will vote for anyone who promises free deals, and has spent a lifetime of evading to the detriment of their own spirit, first and foremost. That's all that matters. The individual that they could have been. It's not impossible, even at the age of 90, I guess, to have a moment of honesty and then die would be worth it. But it's more and more difficult as the years go by to peel back the layers of evasion. And that's the saddest part. And again, when you have a sum of individuals who've spent their entire lives like that, we then have, let's say, people in power who play upon these large swaths of these individuals, right, and want their votes, and then someone else comes along and says, hey, you guys are right all along, vote for me and I'll make sure you're taken care of, and I'll just take money from all those bad rich people who are making profits, and I'll just give it to you if you just vote for me. And so what I want to say is everything matters from the time a child is born till they become a member of society who can actually vote, um, because it's all connected and interlinked. And I no longer think that none of this matters, is what I'm trying to say. There are ramifications even where I work in the corporate world, and just it has its tentacles everywhere.
When people vote the way that you're describing, that has a negative effect on society. But there's also just the personal effect that it has on somebody's soul. The stories that we tell ourselves matter. And I wanted to share a quote that you shared with me, Shireen. This is Shireen's words, but I'd like to read this and then see if you have additional comments to make on it. So you wrote to me, I see every day the horrors of a socialist or communist mindset in individuals, at work, in social circles, etc. It's at the individual level that hearts need to change in order to understand that these things are a lie in the guise of goodness. To fool Christians into selling out to hate their own image created in the likeness of God. From there, to group socialism or communism is a small step. So could you share with us about what led you to those conclusions?
So what I see in daily life is, so the first thing is, I believe that an individual in the span of his or her lifetime, right? The lifetime of an individual, I believe, is sufficient. Well, the lifetime of an individual is sufficient to overcome anything. I'll leave it at that just for a minute. I'll set that aside. And the second thing is that same lifetime of an individual can be used to claim any and all grievances as well that came from outside of that individual's lifetime. For example, slavery 1,000 years ago, or 500 years ago, or their parents being poor, or the grandparents doing something else. Everything that happens before the individual is born, when that individual comes to the age of accountability, if that individual is fed with enough such stuff, that individual then has a choice whether to use all of that data that may really have happened before his or her birth, but the individual has a choice whether to use all of that to make excuses, or the individual obviously has the choice to be honest and to move forward. And that happens somewhere at the age of accountability, right? What I've noticed is in the places where I work, and when I take my kids to soccer or guitar lessons or music lessons, I've noticed at random, but it's actually getting worse in the place where I work. There are people who everyone, doesn't want to take responsibility and do a project, for example, right? But at the same time, I've noticed that if I'm a new member of the team and there are, let's say, 5 or 6 other, I guess, colored people or whatever, right? Brown skinned people, they automatically assume, and this is a weird thing I've noticed, they automatically assume that I'm one of them, so to speak. And they'll just give me a very sympathetic look and sort of nod. But to my own, unfortunately, I never get those. I never understand that silent communication that they're trying to sort of project out and, tell me, right? So then a week passes, the project is done, and we submit it. And let's say I just did the whole thing on my own. These people me to say that we did it, and I probably just say I did it. And then, there's a backlash of there's sort of, I've seen, shock, because I never bought into that silent understanding that we all are brown skinned women, for example. And the worst part is I've seen it's not just one thing. I think you call it intersectionality or something. They silently assume more than one thing. So if you're brown skinned and you're a woman and you're an immigrant, for example, right there, according to the left, you have three things going for you whereby you can feel aggrieved about every single thing that happens in your life, right? Translate that to a work environment. There are these other people who are, let's say, hypothetically, are brown skinned immigrants and women. And if three of them are on my team, for the first few days, they'll give me those vibes as if to say, we hear you, we feel you, even though I'm not saying anything for them to hear or feel. But then after a few days, when I don't behave in accordance with what they think or what they've been taught to think as the way I should behave, they then go through a few more days of shock. And then after that, it's pretty bad in the sense that I've been called all sorts of weird names right there in the corporate world for not subscribing to this aggrieved intersectionality victim mentality, for not subscribing to that. So, and that happens everywhere I go in my work, because I'm in government contracting. I think that also adds to it. So that's just one example.
And in your personal life as well, I imagine that you've encountered people that were surprised when they found out that you are a strong advocate of capitalism and that you're not a Democrat voter, for example.
Yes, and it's interesting you should say that, Cody, because in my personal life, I have had puzzled and surprised, sort of feedback and reactions, but it gave me a new perspective of how others are really, I guess, and now I'm venturing into some areas that I don't know how to explain myself, but I guess there are certain cultures within the United States and across the world that know nothing but the narrative of the left in its various forms. And even before the left became so militant in, you know, spewing out these stories and so relentless, even before that, I would say way back, there always has been different forms of the same narrative. So I think I've had a lot of pushback because I am biblically conservative, and that is reflected in my choice of, let's say, voting for Trump, or even though may not agree with everything he does as a person, I stand on the fact that he represents the policies that align with what I believe in. So I've got a lot of pushback from, various people for that. And then I've just got pushback from a lot of my friends on Facebook. And Cody, I commend you, because were I more vocal on Facebook, I think I would lose all of my 500 odd friends. And I'm contemplating taking that risk very soon in the future, because I do want to be able to say things instead of just posting my children's pictures and stuff. But I will say that I don't think I will find a single friend who would agree with me if I were vocal on Facebook. And I have got a lot of pushback for saying things as simple as, I support Trump, or, our president did a good thing today based on a policy that I agreed with. So there's all of these different things happen within family, friends, and peers. And yet I see that the kindest people on the ground, my soccer mom friends and my coworkers, the kindest people in terms of when there's a real crisis and someone needs real practical help, voluntary individual charity, just based on the free choice of that individual. The kindest people are the so-called conservative people, or the people who think like me. For some reason, they end up being the kindest people of practical help in a crisis. So that is also something that the other people are not able to reconcile. And when faced with that, they try to evade it again. So these are just some of the random things that,
You mentioned two things that I wanted to touch on real fast, just to draw out the significance of them. One, when you mentioned that the culture of the left has actually been around for a long time. It's not just the American left. It's been around in multiple cultures around the world and throughout history. That reminds me of the irony of them calling themselves progressives, because their culture, their ideology is basically no different than ancient tribalism. And that's the sort of tribalism that they want to bring Americans back to. So they're very regressive in that sense. They are for human sacrifices, even child sacrifices. If you look at abortion, they're for the grossest forms of collectivism and tribalism and class warfare and grouping people by every insignificant feature imaginable, like you mentioned, but gender, skin color, country of origin, all of this nonsense, all these things that are totally irrelevant to an individual's dignity or value. They want to break everybody up into these animalistic, tribalistic, warring parties, and there's nothing progressive about that. And it's important that we point that out and don't allow them to get away with thinking of themselves as progressive. And the other thing I wanted to mention is, you talked about the difficulty of communicating ideas to friends and knowing that many of your friends are likely going to disagree. The best way to go about navigating that difficult situation, and it is difficult, is to focus on the method that we were talking about earlier, the method of objectivity, to focus on saying, look, this is what I am rationally convinced is true. If I'm wrong, I want to be proven wrong. And I assume, friend, loved one, whoever it is you're talking to, I assume that if you're wrong, you also want to be proven wrong, correct? Do you want to know and believe and act on what's true like I do? I hope you do. Most people are going to say, when faced with that, yes, because they'll at least pay lip service to the idea that they want to believe and act on what's true. And that's one way to challenge them. It sort of creates a point of contact or a point of crisis for them. Am I going to be fundamentally evasive, or am I going to be fundamentally oriented towards the truth? And they're able to make that decision right then and there. And you can tell pretty quickly whether they're being honest with what they're saying about that decision. And that can give you a really good indication as to how much value there is in potentially continuing the conversation.
Yes, I totally agree with you, Jacob. I haven't really gotten to that point yet where I've asked them that question and created that moment of crisis. And there I must say that I have failed as well in the past, and I'm now trying to rectify that. And what I mean is, I think the very fact that I have reached out and to Cody and you, and I'm actually talking live now, shows the extent of my own evolution from just thinking it doesn't matter, to realizing it matters, and then further to realizing how much it matters. And now I will say, this is the only thing that matters, right? For a society, for individuals that make up a society. And so for me to have evolved to that point, yes, so the next step would definitely be to lovingly confront people. But I've also, if what I'm seeing now is any indication, I guess I have a dark view of humanity where I think most people will choose to not only evade some more, but I've seen peers and colleagues and friends throw in diversion tactics there's a whole bunch of diversionary things you can throw into the debate when your opponent is arguing rationally and logically and holding you to the same standard. There's a certain fear that strikes at the heart, if you will, because you have to give up evasion, and it's really not easy, right? So I've had people throwing things into the mix. Let's say we're talking about individual responsibility, working hard, having a good work ethic, and making your way up in life to whatever level you can, and not blaming illusory things. According to me, there are illusory things such as blaming systemic racism, or I'll pull whatever else it might be. Oh, I'm a woman. There are all these different things, right? But if you bring your opponent to that point of trying to uh, argue logically, more likely than not, they pull other things into the mix, as if to say, they may say, oh, you had a great childhood, or oh, you had it better than most, and or they just throw other things into the mix in order to divert you and to help further their evasion. I mean, that's just been my experience, but I'm sure there are other people who might face their own errors in thinking courageously and go from there. But yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. There are a lot of people who are fundamentally evasive and who, when pressed, will retreat into darkness. But I think that there are also a lot of people who are mixed and who are just confused and scared. And when given the opportunity by somebody who has sort of traversed those scary waters a little bit further ahead from where they have, and if they can see that that person is fine, if you can shine a little bit of hope, then there are a lot of those mixed people who will, I think, eventually come around. And of course, this is where prayer comes in. We want to be praying for those people as well. At the end of the day, it's all about doing what you know is right, speaking the truth, and praying that God will bear the fruit.
As you're watching this, I want you to know there is more to come. And if you would like to join us as a subscriber on Patreon, you can hear the rest of this discussion with the three of us. So thank you for joining today, and I hope to see you on the other side. If you'd like to get that, you can go to christianintellectual.com/Patreon.